Andrew in Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Beautiful. All right. Well, welcome to the show. What's your question?
So I was just wondering, if it was proven that a God outside of a religion existed, would it really matter?
I think so. Yeah.
Well, I think it depends entirely on the God, right? There are definitely gods that are posited that would not make a smidge of difference one way or another for all practical purposes, right? I'm still going to get up, go to work, do my job, come home, make food. You know, that's never going to be something that is going to be impacted by some gods, either gods that used to exist and have died, or maybe very hands-off gods. If it's a god like the God of the Bible, then yeah, that makes a difference, even without the religious component.
I absolutely agree. There are so many different God concepts that, have theologies built around them that if we were to, find out that one of those were true, there are lots of rules and things like that we'd have to look at. And, the interesting thing is, if it did turn out that there was a God, that would not alleviate the moral burden that would be upon them for what goes on in the world. And so while if it did turn out that, let's say, the Christian God existed, I would say that just based off of what we see in the world, it would be a capricious, evil God. But, I also would need to reevaluate how I'm going to do things in light of this idea of eternal suffering.
Well, again, I don't know, Andrew, do you think that if a God exists that things like eternal suffering necessarily also do, or is that part of the religious component that you're not talking about?
Yeah, I guess that's the thing with the religion brings so much, there's so much baggage and ramifications with it. I guess that's why I kind of specified that outside of religion, I hear so many people presenting their version of a God. I just don't really get the reasoning behind that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that people just need an explanation, even if it's wrong. I think societally, we've kind of created this system that rewards people for coming up with answers, even if they're not the correct answer. And, kind of nature abhors a vacuum, that kind of thing. We just invent answers to things if we can't get them readily. And I think that's part of human nature.
It's abhor.
Yeah, I guess so. I kind of, where I'm at is even if the Kalam argument, when I first heard about that, I was like, okay, even if you could get me to a God through that, if it's outside of a religion, I don't really get why. Even if I were to accept, okay, you can prove a God through that, if it's outside of a religion, even if I were to be like, okay, fine, you proved a God, I would be like, so what?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you proved that a God existed through that, it wouldn't really make a difference to me, because that would mean that God always existed, and it still makes no difference. I don't really.
So I disagree. If there was a deity that was proven, are we talking about, a creator deity? Because if we're talking about a creator deity, then I think it would open up entire branches of science to explore. How do you create something from nothing? What is the process by which that happens? What are the circumstances, the situation? What does that need to be? I think it would be really, really interesting to study if it existed. It just doesn't. But
yeah, though I agree with you, Andrew, in terms of the practicality of it, in terms of I can, if I were convinced by some of these philosophical arguments for the existence of God, right? That's what a lot of people are focusing on. I've proven God through the Kalam, or through a fine-tuning argument, or through, modal ontology. And then we get to that endpoint, and even if we were to grant all of that, that doesn't then follow that therefore their religion is accurate or true. And so I think a lot of the time there's that huge gap, and Andrew, you've correctly identified that gap between trying to prove a God exists of some kind, and then making the assumption that the religion is true, we've accurately interpreted what that God wants, this is the version that he likes best, if it is a he in the first place, like all of those things are just kind of packed into that first assumption without actually being explored or drawn out.
Yeah, and another thing, like I don't want to minimize what you do on your show, and I know this might sound terrible, this might come across very wrong, but forgive me if it sounds like this. But when I hear somebody present on your show their viewpoint of a God, it's always like a designer, their designer idea of a God. And I know you guys meet them on their level, and I'm wondering, and I'm wondering why. I know that sounds terrible. But what's the reason? What's the reasoning? What's the end result there?
A couple of things. Number one, you have to realize that the format that we're in is one that is being used to present these cases. So we have a lot of viewers who are not in the United States, and a lot of people who just grew up secular who have no idea what that is. And so believers can present that for non-believers to hear. And also for people who are watching, it helps provide the experience of seeing the conversation had. You know, if you've got that uncle that'll talk down to you all through Thanksgiving and, you know, it's just not going well, you know, how can you have a productive conversation that emphasizes that you're going to be a honest, kind interlocutor? And, you know, if the conversation is going to go poorly, it's going to be because they, you know, did something terribly wrong. You know, we want to be exemplars of what we want to see. And on top of that, we have to share the world with them, dude. And because of that, we better be able to put into words what we believe and why. Because the whole point is listening to them about where they're at. But if we can't even talk about where we're at, or, you know, why there's a problem here, or get people to think about it, then, you know, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. I feel like the format of this show is one that helps people who are watching it, who can see that conversation had without losing family members, who can maybe explore the philosophy and theology of it a little bit more, who can learn more about religious callers and what their viewpoints are, and hopefully get a good example of how to have those conversations. I think it's incredibly useful. Now, I think your question was probably framed in the one-on-one, right? Why should I have these? You don't have to. You don't have to. But don't expect that people are going to vote the same as you if they haven't heard an opposing opinion. You know?
No, I was actually asking specifically from your, like, what is actually from your, like, your reasoning, what are you hoping to gain?
Did that answer the question?
It did. I always watch from my point of view what I wouldn't know what I would hope to gain, simply because if you were to prove a God to me, I would simply be like, okay, I don't know where I'm supposed to go from there. So I guess I was approaching it from that viewpoint.
Well, there's also the component, and this is something that I talk about a lot and we'll be talking about much more. It's that concept of, excuse me, I'm losing my voice.
No worries. Just 1 second. Via's taking a water break.
I don't know why that happens. I've talked a lot today. It's not like I haven't used my voice yet. Andrew, for me, a lot of it comes back to being empathetic listeners and respecting the other person on the other end. I know that when I was a Christian, I thought that I had come up with a lot of these arguments myself. Or I had taken these arguments and kind of reconfigured them in my head. And if I was talking to somebody about it, I was super excited. I was like, hey, this is a really cool idea that I just had, like not knowing that it had been had multiple times
for hundreds of years.
Right. And so my assumption every time someone calls in is this is the first time they're seeing the show. They have not heard all of the other callers giving their versions of the same argument, and they're coming at it trying to share something that they think is new with us. And in that mindset, it makes a lot more sense to be like, okay, well, caveat, we've heard this version of the argument before, but what are you bringing to the table? And really let them kind of get it out, because if we don't, they're not going to feel respected and they're not going to call back. And we do want to have continuing conversations on the show.
Yeah, and just to bookend that specifically, people say, well, we've been watching the show forever. You've already done it. But the thing is, we get messages from people all of the time saying they've just discovered us. And so we really do find ourselves in that situation. Mm-hmm. So, anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that actually answered my question really well. I guess, like, I was actually raised Christian, so I know how it is believing something. The thing was, for me, I am, like, what I left behind, I'm like, I can't see believing something beyond, like, I guess approaching it from any other way, like thinking, okay, I'm willing to hear something beyond that, like
right. It does
approaching it.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time to actually like be able to get out of that mindset that you were raised in and actually try and see it from different perspectives. I totally get it. Andrew, we are going to have to move on, but if you would like to call back and maybe talk about your deconversion or questions you still have based on your past Christian worldview, absolutely feel free to call back.
Specifically questions. Talking about deconversions is a little more nihilistic so for atheist, but questions that we can help answer.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right.